Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing Eastern Front week. And if you happen to catch the earlier show, we are now splitting the next show into two. So three parts about Nigel Askey talking about the data and the statistics of Soviet losses. But as I said in the beginning of that show, and I'm saying at the beginning of this show, what I like about this channel is the fact we tackle this subject from different angles. So this morning's show and the other one tomorrow morning, very much data-driven, looking at graphs and statistics and losses and how that history is analyzed and interpreted and changed. Then Prit Buttar took us through the nature of a battle with all the stages of that on an operational level. And today with Dr. Waitman Beorn, we're looking at that horrible aspect of what was happening in the rear, as Operation Barbarossa curses ahead initially and then grinds to a halt. Behind that is all this baggage of how they deal with the areas they are taking, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So if you haven't ever seen Dr. Waitman Beorn before, he is a Holocaust historian, a former US Army cavalryman, and he's on today to talk about this aspect of the war. So good evening, Waitman. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
And since the last time you were on, we've met in person, which is nice. We both know the other has actually got legs. I make that joke every time, and it was nice to catch up at We Have Ways. So
absolutely.
With the we know you are very active in trying to make sure the world doesn't disconnect the military side of World War II from the tragic Holocaust side, and those two aspects of the study must go hand in hand. Before we go on into your presentation today, do you feel it's kind of a losing battle trying to keep the atrocities as part of the study of military history, because there still is that obsession with the aircraft and the tanks? Is it something you feel you're winning at, or is it an ongoing struggle?
I think we're winning. I think there are lots of indicators of that. And not to sort of, play to the audience, but the We Have Ways Fest is a great example, and the podcast also, of, incorporating, they had a Holocaust survivor, for example, at the most recent festival. They include, conversations about these aspects of the war that are important. And so I think that there is winning going on. I mean, I certainly don't think that it's a battle that is won yet, because it is easy for some people, I think, to focus in on the things that they're interested in, whether it's, tanks and planes and battles and who's going up one side of the hill and down the other, and because of the way we've often taught this subject and a lot of the ways that some of the, older literature has been written, it has sort of siloed these things into sort of separate spheres. But I think, we're starting certainly to see both, popular histories, public scholars, the media, movies, films, documentaries, beginning to really recognize these things are inseparable. So I think it's a battle that we're still fighting, but we are making headway, I suppose.
We are, and I think that what's important is we're not bringing these things together for no reason. We're bringing them together because one it affects the other. To understand how the military operations are sometimes failing or succeeding, it's because of what they're doing behind it. And the same thing, from the other point of view, the way the Holocaust is panning out is because of how the military side of the war is panning out. So to treat them separately is not the way to understand the whole mechanism, the whole experience. So we're not going to overload you with images today, folks. It's just, it's quite a short notice show, but we're kind of focusing on Belarus a little bit because you've written about that, Waitman, and the link to your books are in the description below, folks. And I recommend both of Waitman's books and his website, and get yourself onto any podcast or show he appears on, because you're in for great information. But we'll load up that first slide, and we're kind of a fairly informal, loose chat today, but we're going to look at the POWs, we're going to look at the civilian experience, the Holocaust, and just how the Wehrmacht particularly managed, is an odd word I chose to use there, but managed their occupation, their drive east. So, we'll start off with you, Waitman, kind of giving us an overview.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, one of the things to recognize, just to very quickly jump back to what you said earlier, is that if you look at the history of genocide, almost without exception, every single genocide in the history of the world has taken place in the context of a war. And so that in and of itself, I think, is a great starting point for why do we include genocide, in this case, the Holocaust, and other genocides that took place during the Second World War in the context of the Second World War, right? And to sort of segue into a little bit of what we're talking about here, one of the arguably sort of forgotten or lesser known, what I would really consider to be another genocide, is that of the Soviet prisoners of war, carried out by the German military. And just, I've given these numbers, before and in other places, but upwards of 2 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity, which is really an astronomical number, particularly if you start to put it into context. And one of the contexts as an American, that is easy to put it into is somewhere around 450,000 American service people were killed during the Second World War in both the Pacific and Europe. 450,000 dead. And we're talking 2 million Soviet prisoners of war, simply prisoners of war. It's sort of an incredible number, and the percentages also tell the story, where 57% of Red Army soldiers in German hands died. So the death rate of Soviet prisoners of war in German hands was 57%. By comparison, Allied prisoners in Japanese hands in the Pacific, it was around, I'm trying to remember now, 20, 27, 29, something like that. And then, the numbers of Allied prisoners in German hands, is much, 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 much less. And then the number of Germans who died in Allied hands is negligible, small percentage. So, just to give you a sense of how many people are dying, arguably more Soviet prisoners of war died every day on the Eastern Front, certainly in the first 2 years of the war, than Allied prisoners of war died in German hands during the entire war. It just gives you some numbers, right? And there, it's a phenomenon that, much like the clean Wehrmacht myth, has its apologists. First and foremost, the German military itself after the war, who sort of say, well, we were just so successful. We had so many prisoners, and we were just overwhelmed with the numbers, and we really couldn't do anything about it. And what a shame, and most of these people, died of disease, and we did the best we could, but we couldn't care for them. And obviously, yes, there is some element of truth to that, but not very much, because number one, the German military knew what its operational plans looked like. They were these Kesselschlachten, these cauldron battles, right? These great encirclements. So they knew they were going to take large numbers of prisoners. Like, that was obvious from the way that they planned to do it. And we have documentation already from before the campaign started, which essentially said, we are not going to provide prisoners of war with much of anything. We're not going to provide them with medical care. If there's any medical care, it has to be done with their support equipment that we capture with them, et cetera, et cetera. They'll be fed on horse meat. To the extent that we know what the caloric intake that was intended for prisoners is, and it's not sufficient for life. And so we have this image here, which is of the Drozhdy camp, which is in the vicinity of Minsk. And it gives you a sense of and this is in the 15th of July, so less than a month after the campaign has started. And, this is a place where they had circa 100,000 human beings in what you see here, essentially a massive open field surrounded by barbed wire. And that's it, in the heat of July in Belarus, which is quite significant. Without access to medical care, without access to sufficient food, water, etc. And this is intentional, right? And then along with this, and I'll pause here, but then along with this, you have the Commissar Order, which was an explicit command that said any Red Army political officer who is captured shall be shot out of hand or not even transferred to a prisoner of war camp, either executed immediately or not even forwarded. And I'll pause here, and operating within all of these camps was the initial stages of the Holocaust, in the sense that there were SS units as well as German army units that were singling out Jewish prisoners of war and eventually, in many cases, shooting them as well. So here you have another one of these really interesting and important places where you have overlap between sort of this idea of the Holocaust as something separate that doesn't take place, in the military sphere, but actually it's happening right along with it.
And just to be clear, this is the whole mechanism of Operation Barbarossa. I mean, it's already come up in the sidebar about the Einsatzgruppen and things like that. The very known now extreme SS elements, but this is you're saying it's a universal policy that applies to the entire movement of Germans east.
Yeah, I mean, and the drum that I always beat in this regard is that lots of people have written, even fairly eminent scholars have written about sort of the barbarization of war on the Eastern Front, and how this was just a really, atrocious, barbaric, brutal, no holds bar sort of war, and the implication is often that that this is exceptional.
Yeah, it kind of escalates because of a tit for tat almost kind of
right. Whereas
situation.
Whereas I say that actually the Western Front is the exception. The Western Front is the aberration. The quasi, and I say quasi because it's not super civilized, but it's far more civilized because of racial affinities and issues like this. The war on the Eastern Front is precisely the kind of war that the Germans want to fight. It's a war of annihilation. It's a clash of ideologies. It's a clash of cultures. It is a zero-sum win or lose game in which one side will win and the other side will be utterly and completely destroyed and annihilated. Whereas the war in the West is never going to be like that, because the plans and the ambitions that the Germans have in Western Europe are fundamentally different than they are in the East. Even though they do, in 1940, murder, all the French Black African troops that they come across and things like this. But it's not nearly the same scale or qualitative situation that you have here in Belarus.
Thank you, by the way, everyone, for your comments there. We got lots of comments about the film Come and See has come up a lot, Waitman, about people not being brave enough to watch that. And, and again, that's kind of the extreme SS element. But, we're talking about, the Wehrmacht, the entire mechanism here. But we'll keep on going and with your images. And yeah, I'm not going to say I'm enjoying it so far, because it's hard when you're talking about a subject like this, but it's informative and we're moving forwards.
Of course. I mean, and the significance of Belarus here, when I was writing the book, I was just I was quite fortunate in that what I was looking for was a way to understand the trajectory that the Wehrmacht launched itself on, which eventually got it, neck deep in the Holocaust. And I was very fortunate to find a series of essentially case studies that also came along with them. Judicial cases and post-war trials and things like this, to give lots of different angles, and they all happen to be set essentially in Belarus, in what is now Belarus, which is significant because arguably, and this is not my take, what's his name, Tim Snyder in Bloodlands, much of that book takes place in Belarus. This is a place which really, really suffered, the extent of the war in exceptional ways. When I was visiting the town of Kripke, which we'll see a little bit of it later, I ended up interviewing a wonderful old woman who had lived there all her life, and she had witnessed the murder of the Jews in this very small village. And before she told me the story of what she had seen, what she had witnessed, and she told me her personal family story. And her family story was that her father and brother had died in a concentration camp, had been burned to death in a house by the Nazis, by the German army. Her mother had died in a concentration camp in Belarus. It's one of these small sort of ad hoc places. Her other brother had died at the front in the Red Army, and she had survived with her aunt in the forest for 3 years or so. And that is not an uncommon story for people that lived in Belarus. I read the stat someplace that the country has yet to recover its population that it would have had the Second World War not taken place. So it's really, and of course, it's also for the purposes of the Holocaust. It is a large swath of the Pale of Settlement, which was the region in which Jews were forced to settle under the Tsars, and so they had a large Jewish population. Parts of it used to be Poland, etc. And so it really is a good place. I use scare quotes here. Is a good place to look at all of sort of the horrors that take place behind the lines. And so what we're seeing here. This is just a really this image is not super critical, but what it does show is a division rear area. And so all the things that I talked about in the book, and this is not a book plug, but this is by way of background, took place in what's called Army Group Center Rear, or the Rückwärtiges Heeresgebiet Mitte. So we know about the Army Group North, Center, and South, and all of their sort of military exploits. Well, there was a specific area behind each one of those units, which fell under the military's control. And then farther back, it begins to fall under civilian control. And this sort of moves forward as the front moves forward. And so here you just have one example of the 286th Security Division, which is the parent division of one of the units that committed some of these atrocities. And here you sort of see they see Smolensk there. And just to give you a sense of just how massive a territory these rear area units are responsible for, right? And so here you see the scale there is it's 1 to 1 million meters, right? So I mean it's a massive sort of region, and this has important implications later when we talk about treatment of civilians as well as treatment of partisans. So so that's what I think this is a nice image, and I know that some of you really like maps and stuff like that. So here's a
and this is the very area Pripyat was talking about yesterday, or behind the area Pripyat was talking about, that central front there, that didn't really shift very much between August 42 and March 1943. This is what's happening behind it. And when both sides, the Germans and the Soviets, are desperately short of personnel, to think there's these huge organizations in the rear, as you'll come to, basically just going around killing people, I suppose is the simple way of saying it. It's extraordinary that the human catastrophe of it is interesting, but also the use of resources, the fact that the Third Reich is choosing to allocate this percentage of its forces for just this purpose. But as you say, it's total annihilation, or it's all or nothing, isn't it? It's got to be complete victory or nothing.
Yeah, and there's also sort of the mundanity of it all, in the sense that and we can talk about this as well, and particularly if anyone has questions. We know about the Einsatzgruppen, who are sort of like the A team of the killers, who are going around carrying out a lot of these massive killing operations. But then we have sort of the day-to-day, which is this example of the Security Division, that's just sort of doing things on a daily basis, and we'll talk about what some of those things are. This is actually, I like this a lot, because I like maps and I like diagrams and things as well. But this is a route security plan showing the route from this place. I'm not sure exactly where that is, Lesna to Smolensk. And so obviously this is not the actual route of the, so it's kind of like a subway map, right? It's like,
Right,
it's
yeah.
like a notional sort of thing. What you see is that one of the main responsibilities, at least initially, so this is the situation of 28 July. So again, just a little over a month in, is to secure these routes because logistics is important and because there are very few roads of any quality. And the German army knows that these are, vulnerabilities. And so here you sort of see what they've done is they've divided up this route between certain units, with responsibilities. There's Minsk there as well. Just to give you a sense, by the way, the fact that they're already at Minsk, by July 28th, gives you a sense of just how fast and how far the Wehrmacht is moving in Barbarossa, which has implications later on. But if you look at some of these things a little more closely, you'll see, for example, these little blocks. So there's one here under Minsk where it says Dulag, and then there's another one at Kochanovo, Dulag, Orsha, Dulag. Those are Durchgangslager. Those are POW camps. But this is also interesting to me because what it does is it places a battalion of the 354th Infantry Regiment here at Krupka, which is right in the center of your screen. And that is where it takes place. It participates in the murder of 1,000 Jews in a village of 2,000 people, which is the starting point. When I'm studying this, it's the first major massacre of Jews that I'm looking at in the book. Interestingly enough, the same unit, the 354th Infantry Regiment, the 3rd Battalion, was part of the guard force at Drozhdy, at that Drozhdy POW camp that we looked at earlier. And so you also have a process, I would argue, of acculturation, of climatization to the Nazi genocidal project. These guys are witnessing and or participating at this POW camp in the killing of POWs, all the other things that are taking place there. They're watching Jews being singled out. They're watching everything else being executed. And then very shortly on, they're participating in this as well. And so this is an interesting, and this comes from their war diary, right? So this is from the German archives in Freiburg.
Wow. And then the fact they're normalizing it, the people who are involved in participating in these horrific events, it's kind of starting off on a smaller scale and it's becoming normalized very quickly. And we've done shows in the past about the reliance the Germans had on alcohol and kind of unit bonding. And this is what we do in this unit, and it becoming part of their own almost celebration of who they are, whether they're Wehrmacht or SS. They kind of make cartoons about it, they make jokes about it. There's Ian Carr asked earlier and I'll ask it to you, if there's a competition almost between the Wehrmacht and the SS and the Waffen-SS and the groups about who is doing the most, to what it becomes who's at the top of the league of killing this month. Does it get that way?
I mean, arguably within the Einsatzgruppen, there's some of that. There's a very famous report that comes out from Einsatzgruppe A. Many of you probably seen this. It's a map with coffins on it that essentially shows how they have cleared out all the Jews in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Not so much a competition in the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht likes to think that it's better than the SS because it's not involved in sort of some of these activities. Of course, it is, but the competition isn't there. Where you find sort of I suppose some of the competition stuff, we can talk about this, is as this goes on and the German army units in the rear area begin murdering Jews wherever they find them in the villages, they report them as partisans. And so there is a sort of sense of body count, right? And of metrics of success by body count. So that if we say that we killed 30 partisans, then somehow that means that we're doing a good job of sort of fighting this insurgency and that kind of thing. I think that might be where you see some of the competition, less with between the SS, because the Wehrmacht, even if it doesn't act this way, would certainly say that it doesn't dirty its hands with the kind of things that the SS does.
Wow. Yeah, well, we'll move on. I mean, it's harrowing and it's fascinating at the same time. And I'll hand it back to you.
So I mean, I just included some images here, because I think people like images, but I think they also give us a sense of the place that we're talking about. When I was doing my sort of field research, driving around in the backwoods of Belarus, I came across this town of Bober, and here's a Jewish cemetery which had existed, since the 1500s. This is how long many of these communities had existed before they're annihilated by the Nazis. And I think it's important just to highlight, that Jews, in the context of this discussion and everything else, they're not just numbers, and they're not just numbers of victims and people that are killed and abused. They had a thriving culture that, in many ways, left a serious mark on the land and the territory. Many of these villages, because of the way that Jewish history worked in Eastern Europe, had large percentages of Jewish population. So some of them were even majority Jewish, depending on the village, because of the trades that Jews tend to be in and these kinds of things. And then the war comes through, and the Holocaust comes through, and the Wehrmacht, not least of it, comes through, and these things are sort of completely destroyed.
I have a great question from Mary Waitman, who we of course both know. In terms of motivation, how much was racial ideology versus Lebensraum?
Well, I think these things are all they're all connected. The Nazis have an idea of their own manifest destiny. The idea that the East is their land to occupy and to colonize, and so Lebensraum is part of that. But what makes the East, what justifies the East as a place for Germans to conquer, is the fact that the people living there are racially inferior and don't have any claim to the land. And in many ways, the Nazis point to the Americans in the West, the European Americans in the West, the Canadians. They point to the British in India explicitly, as justifications. Look, these people are doing this. It's the natural way of things that a superior race will take the land with which it can do better things because it's more advanced, more civilized than these other people. And so I think the two things are deeply connected. I don't think, to play out somebody's comment here, I don't think it's an excuse. I mean, I think that the Germans had very real, concrete plans for why they needed the Lebensraum in the East. They needed the Ukraine for creation of food. They needed the resources. They recognized they were never going to have a overseas empire because they could never challenge the British Navy. So there's a reason why Lebensraum demanded a continental imperial colonial project.
We've got another question. I've just found it. I've lost it, from Richard Trainer there, saying, is there any basis for the myths that it's not the front line, but more the follow-on support troops that lack discipline and rape and torture? Or is this part of the cleaning up the military on both sides?
Well, I think this is a great point. And yes, obviously frontline units, when they're in the front, are not participating in the same kinds of atrocities as units in the rear, because they're busy, fighting people that shoot back and things like this. However, we know that, units get cycled back and forth. So this 286 Security Regiment, which is a second line division, is participating in all kinds of atrocities against civilians, and then it gets put at the front and gets annihilated. But it itself becomes a frontline unit, and it's fighting, against the, sort of the Soviet counteroffensives. And we see things like, the second SS, which was certainly a frontline unit, and then it goes to France and it does Oradour, right? So, I mean, I think it's a question, I've said this before, it's a question of opportunity rather than motive. That most of these units are ready and able, given the opportunity. And then, of course, we also have to talk about what kinds of atrocities are we talking about. Frontline units are deeply involved in victimizing prisoners of war. They're deeply involved in executing Red Army officers. They are very often involved in creating these Wüste-Zonen, these desert zones of 5 kilometers on either side of the front line, removing civilians from those. So, I mean, it's a question of of what kinds of things they're doing, but I think they're all involved potentially in some way or another.
No, definitely. And thanks everybody for all your wonderful comments and also some quite disturbing comments, or rather the subject matter that's coming up is not disturbing. The way you're making a comment is not disturbing, but this is why it's important to discuss. And so many people have already said thank you for tackling this subject, because someone said earlier, is it how when I had Alina on a few months ago, how difficult it is just studying this horrific aspect of it. And I think that's another reason, going back to the fact that the separation is it is just easy to sit in a pub and say, so what's your favorite aircraft from World War II, or what's your favorite tank, or whatever. And there's no kind of victims in that kind of conversation. There's no, but as soon as you get into these subjects there, it is just very dark and very heavy. So do you after studying it for what 20 years now, I guess it's been on nearly.
Yeah, close.
Does it get any easier? Does it get harder?
I mean, I've talked about this a little bit before. I mean, obviously, there is some level of separation you have to have from the topic. I think it certainly got harder after I became a parent. Which again is not to suggest that one has to have kids to be upset when you're reading about kids being killed. Obviously, that's not true. But it just hits differently because I have the blood knowledge rather than the head knowledge of what it means to be a parent. And obviously my sort of trajectory has shifted in things I look at. I mean, it doesn't get easier, but it's important, and I find that the public history side of things helps, because getting to speak to a larger audience, makes it, to sound very trite, but it's true, makes it worthwhile. So
yeah, and I want to just say thank you to the people who are watching tonight, because it is a conscious decision to watch a show that is darker. And I'm very glad that the audience I've cultivated over these last 2 years, they don't just pick and choose the sort of the sexy shows. They will take on the ones about the more challenging subjects. And in fact, some of those ones about the challenging subjects get better views than the ones about the subjects that get discussed endlessly on YouTube. So I'm very grateful that people will stick with it all. But we've got another killing site up on screen, so I think we should move on to the horrors of what happened here.
Yeah, I'm not going to dwell on this. Because we have another image coming up as well. I just wanted to give a sense of what it's like, to visit these places. This is in Novogrudok. This is a site where 10,000 Jews were murdered in one day. Oh, no, sorry, this is 5,000. Sorry, 5,000 Jews were murdered in one day by a German army unit in conjunction with some Einsatzgruppen. And it gives you a sense of the terrain. There are multiple sort of grave pits. This is the one that's memorialized with a sort of concrete boundary. But if you walk a bit into the woods, you see sort of undulations, which are clearly man-made and unnatural. And these places exist all across Belarus, and not just Belarus, across Ukraine, across Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states, across Poland in some places. And they're just part of the landscape. And they're places that the locals know, but most of them, unless they have sort of a large community someplace else in the world who comes back to commemorate them, they sort of remain uncommemorated. And we can go on to the next if you want.
And the fact they're still being found. I did the show the Romania week earlier in the year, and how there are still there are massacre sites being found not just once every 10 years, but they're finding 3 or 4 sites a year in some of these areas of Transylvania and what have you. Just they go to a village to investigate one little story they've heard about, and they find 5 more there. It's the sort of Pandora's box that opens, a spider's web of just ongoing atrocities and disasters. And I'm assuming Belarus, and as you said, if it hasn't yet recovered its wartime population, there's still a lot of work to be done to investigate.
Yes, I mean, and it's interesting. One of the, I suppose, benefits of Belarus sort of being the last Soviet state is that things, and we'll see in the next couple of images, things are not changed very much at all. It's not a situation like Babi Yar in Kiev, where it's been built over, and there's all kinds of development things that happened. These places are more or less the same. And here you have an image of the Slonim killing site shortly after the war, when the locals came to sort of excavate it, because there were Jewish and non-Jewish victims, and sort of gives you a sense of what this means to the communities. And Slonim is a place where 10,000 Jews from the town itself were murdered in one day, just to give you a sense. And then throughout the war, both Jews and non-Jews were murdered there as well. In this case, it was a joint operation between the Wehrmacht and Einsatzgruppen units. But it's also, during the war, people know who's buried outside of town, and then they come to excavate. And there's a series of pictures. I didn't choose the gruesome ones, but there's a series of pictures, that have been documented here. So if you go to the next one. Yeah, so this is the last of the killing sites. This is Krupke, which is the one that I talk about, quite intimately in the book, where only, and again, scare quotes here, the numbers were only 1,000, but the village population of Krupke was 2,000. So we're talking 50% of the village was murdered by that 354th Infantry Regiment. So if you remember back on the slide where we had the route map with route security, Krupke was one of the sites. And so here in this grove of trees is the killing site. And if you look, the black and white image in the corner there comes from the Soviet Extraordinary State investigations already in 1944. So when the Soviets arrive in 1944, they're already investigating war crimes and atrocities. And this is the map that they draw of the Krupke killing site. And, when I got there, it's not marked, but you can follow the terrain, and I could follow the map, because you can see there's a sort of a squiggly line, and that's stream. And if you look just over behind that copse of trees, you see that sort of low vegetation, that's the stream bed. So this place is exactly the same as it was, with the exception of a Soviet era memorial stone on it. And it's in the middle of somebody's field someplace, and the locals know where it is, but there's no sign from the highway. There's there's nothing else. But it was very haunting to sort of show up there, and it was just as it described, not only in the Soviet Extraordinary Commission, but literally when the soldiers who participated in it described the site, it's the same as it was.
And I think that's what, from my takeaway from your books and your writing is, as you said, Belarus makes for a good, again, quotes, case study, because so little has changed, and because the violence there was so widespread. There's a lot to get you into, a lot of information there, a lot of and I don't think that it's been tapped enough as an example. I think when we read about the Holocaust in the Western world, it's still very much the Auschwitz, Dachau kind of experience. The earlier Holocaust by bullets, I think, is something we in the West don't tend to hear as much about. And I'll be intrigued at some point as to why you think that is. Is it because the death camps are kind of coming later in the war, so therefore there are more people who survived that or experienced that or liberated that, and that's what kind of fed the public thirst for the understanding of the Holocaust? Is that where it comes from?
I think there's to summarize it relatively quickly, I think there's a lot of reasons. One is the Cold War. The majority of these kinds of this side of the Holocaust, and also atrocities against non-Jewish civilians, which are legion as well, is behind the Iron Curtain, both in a popular sense and in an archival sense. So if you're a scholar that wants to do research on this, you literally don't have access to the materials, right, even sometimes to the people involved. So there's that aspect of it. I think there is a sense amongst some that this is a sort of Soviet suffering, and so we don't really care as much. But also, if you look at the propaganda, and I say that in the neutral sense, the film footage, newsreel footage of liberations of camps, by the British, by the Americans, that dominates, if you want to say, of the Holocaust coverage. That dominates the sort of popular conception of what the Holocaust is. for a very, very long time. And, you liberators, at least in the West, allied British and American liberators liberate German concentration camps. They don't come across these killing sites. They don't come across Auschwitz. They don't come across the other killing centers, which have been destroyed anyway. And so I think that, that's one of the reasons why we don't have the same visceral understanding, that someone of our generation growing up in the East has, because it wasn't in the sort of media ecosystem. It wasn't as dominant as these other images are. Yeah, and so here you have an example of sort of the next two slides are sort of the more things change, etc. This is in Slonim when I visited. In the local museum is the photograph on the right, which is civilians, probably non-Jews, who have been hung as a reprisal or for some reason by the German authorities, who most likely are Wehrmacht, right? Every one of these towns has what's called an Ortskommandantur, or like a village commander. And then the larger towns have a Feldkommandantur, which is just the same thing. And basically they're the military government of the town. And here you sort of see this really shocking image on the right, and then there's the same building in 2009. It's the same place. And if you go to the next slide, same thing. So this is Slonim as well. Here's that I just mentioned, that Ortskommandantur, the local military headquarters, which again is run by the Wehrmacht. Oftentimes it has SD or military or military police or even police battalion people attached to it, but it's run by the military. And here today, it's still the police station, and you can tell the very distinctive building here. With it's the same place, right?
Well, and then we're going to move to the partisan side of things, because you made the point earlier that the systematic approach to atrocities was very much in the planning stage. They knew they'd be taking these large areas. They knew they would have to subdue, whatever word you want to use, the population in the rear areas. But could there have been any kind of prediction of what the partisan reaction was going to be? Because again, with the ideology, the Germans are going in there thinking that these people are second rate, they're third rate, they're not even human beings, they're subhuman. I suppose I'm wondering, did they not give them in their thinking the kind of the ability to react to this in a military way, and they would just allow themselves to be persecuted? But in fact, what happened is quite an active partisan. The movie Defiance came up in the sidebar, by the way. What your opinions are on that, and that ordinary people are pushed to fight back because there's nothing else to do. So was that something they couldn't predict or did predict? Or
well, there's a lot to this. One is, of course, that, and there's a scholar named Isabel Hall who wrote a book called Absolute Destruction, which is a really good read, and I recommend it. She makes the argument that the German military from the Franco-Prussian War forward has a very unrealistic and unachievable conception of what a peaceable rear area needs to be, and the extent that they are hyper vigilant and prone to overreact to anything that might be considered some form of unrest or partisan activity, and as a result, they go overboard in sort of their reactions to it. And you see this in the First World War, where in Belgium and in parts of occupied France, where jumpy sentry at one end of town fires his rifle at something he thinks is a partisan, and sentry on the other side of town thinks he's being shot at, and the Germans murder civilians. At least 6,000 civilians are murdered by the German army in the First World War in this sort of context. And you take that, if you follow Isabel Hall's argument, you take that to the Eastern Front and just multiply it by 1 million, because one of the things that I always like to point out is that for a German or a French person or a Swiss person or whatever, for a sort of Western Central European person, Belarus is Vietnam. It's these dark, impenetrable forests, these grim fairy tale kinds of forests, compared to the forests that they're used to, these very well tended, kept places. It's scary. And it's either these sort of deep, dark, scary forests, or it's these massive open plains, which are also scary in some different ways. And so, you have already this sort of pathology coming in, which is exacerbated by the racial elements, exacerbated by the very real sort of fears and phobias, but also not supported by evidence, because one of the things that Stalin does in the interwar period is he kills off people that know how to do partisan warfare, because he's worried that they might do partisan warfare against him. Also, I mentioned earlier the speed of the advance. The speed of the advance meant that massive swaths of territory are conquered so fast that there's really no time for the Soviets or even the locals to sort of set up some kind of underground or resistance network, et cetera, et cetera. A great example, I'll be very quick about this, but a great example of this is there's a book by Barbara Epstein about the Minsk ghetto. And in that book, she talks about the non-Jewish resistance in the city of Minsk. And they called themselves the second, Minsk resistance front, because they assumed there had to be a first Minsk resistance front that was the official one, run by the Soviets, not knowing that the Soviets had completely bugged out and were gone, and they were the only resistance. But they assumed, well, there has to be one, but there wasn't, because it takes into the summer of 42 and the winter of 42 you start to see the Soviets parachuting people in and building up these partisan units and things like that, at least in Belarus. And then other parts in Ukraine and in the Baltic states, it's further complicated by the fact that there are plenty, and someone mentioned this in the sidebar, there are plenty of homegrown militia units that are supporting the Nazis. And then in Ukraine, you get the very complex issue of, you have sort of the communist insurgents that are fighting the Nazis. You have some Ukrainians that are fighting with the Nazis, and some that are also fighting against Poles because they're trying to drive. I mean, it gets very complex.
I mean, you can literally have liberation and murders happening in the same place at the same time, depending on the point of view and the background of the inhabitants, depending on how they see it.
Yeah, and so what you have, and I'm not going to rehash the argument in the book too much because we don't have time, but what you have is this pathology of seeing partisans everywhere, when certainly, for example, the time this map is printed, someone mentioned they wish the keys were in English. Just to give you a sense, the dark area is lebhaft, or lively. So lively partisan activity. The sort of middle is like middle, and then the light is little partisan activity. But there's not to speak of. It's not your stereotype from Defiance of like, no-go terrain and places where in the rear areas where you just don't go at night, or these kinds of things. That happens later. But at least in the initial stages, that's not really what's happening. What many rear area units are running across are bands of Soviet soldiers, many of whom don't want to fight anymore, who are sort of hiding in the woods and things like that. But it's not the Bilski brothers yet, right? That's not what's happening. And what makes this so pernicious is that what you have in the end, and if we go to the next image, here's an image from one of the units in my book, and this is the Captino, it's Italian. The caption, misspelled that, sorry, that's written on the back of it by the German soldier was partisans, bandits were apprehended. And we don't know who these people are. We don't know whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish or what. But what happens very quickly is that Jews are conflated with partisans, which are conflated with communists, which essentially means that any civilian that looks askance, Hitler's words, looks askance at a German soldier can be killed or apprehended or whatever for that activity. To the extent that when there's a report that comes out, it's sort of guidance on partisans. And one of the things it says, I remember this distinctly even many years later, it said that watch out for old women and children, because the people who look like they're the least of a threat can often be the biggest threat in terms of like informing the partisans. So really, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't at this point. If you are a military-age male, you're obviously a partisan. If you're Jewish, you're obviously a partisan. And if you're an old woman, because you don't look like a military-age male, you could also be a partisan. So it becomes very, very ugly very, very quickly. And if we go to the last image, and then I want to stop so that we can have questions.
Yeah, and in your research there, because obviously using German documents, limited amounts of Soviet documents, is that this understanding of what is meant by language, in that the putting down of a partisan uprising, as you've made clear, if I'm simplifying, could just simply be a purge of anybody who they didn't like in that particular village, using partisan as the excuse. Someone, being disarmed with a rifle because they're handing it over. So when you went to these places, did you find that the kind of the local version didn't kind of connect with what the German version was? In the terms of the German version, the report says this was a quashing of a resistance uprising, partisan uprising. When you get there, and you find out basically it's just herding people into a barn and murdering them.
I mean, certainly, by the time you get to sort of the end of the trajectory that I'm looking at it in that particular book, you have units going on so-called Jew hunts, where they're going out in the local population and looking for Jews and killing them, and then reporting them to their higher command as partisans killed. And you get the lie in this is it's often right there in the documents, because they'll say, we annihilated this partisan band of 40 people, and we captured 5 pistols, and we took no casualties, right? So who are you fighting if these are the numbers that you're coming back with, right? Because when they fight actual partisans, they do very badly, and you lose lots of people because the insurgent often has the advantage, particularly in these environments. And so it becomes very clear that the people they're killing are civilians, oftentimes Jews being reported as civilians, or they are just civilians in general, or there was from previous work I did, and I'll stop here, but there's some previous work I did, a place just outside, called Perogruzhnoye, just outside of Stalingrad, where there was a German army signal unit. So these are radio people. And they believed they had caught the partisans signaling, or the local civilians signaling the partisans where they were, because they could see these flashing lights at night. So they go in the village and they murder 40 Jews and some other people. And then later on, one of the people realizes that what they were seeing were the headlights of passing cars going behind a house. And so headlights, no headlights, headlights looks like a flashing light. And that's why they killed, 40 people, because they thought that was the partisans, right? And this image is just, to me, really powerful as well, because this is the unit that murdered all the Jews in Krupki, and they go on these patrols to try to find the partisans, where they disguise themselves as civilians, which is not legal, by the way. And the clothes they're wearing came from murdered Jews in the village. So again, all of these things, sort of connected together.
Wow, and it's obviously the case that the lines get very blurred, and of identities. And I'm speaking when Mag, my other half, did a presentation about the Jews of Normandy. It was surgical. They knew who the Jewish population were, because they had all the data. They had all the people who had been gradually reporting all their possessions and their things. And when they came to deport those they wanted to deport, they went in there very surgically and removed them and took them out. This seems, that if you're standing in the wrong place when a German unit arrives in your village, you could just get shot, hung, murdered, because a mistaken identity. So it's a lot more random isn't quite the word I'm looking at, but I think that's it's confused there. I'm going to ask you a few questions now.
Just to handle it really quickly, one of the things is that I haven't mentioned a lot here, because we've been talking about a lot of things, is of course that actually when the German army shows up in a lot of these villages, if the mayor is non-Jewish, they know. So like the local population is critical in helping the Nazis identify and murder Jews, because you're right, for the German from Berlin, all he sees are dirty, nasty Soviet peasants. But the locals know precisely which families are Jewish and which ones aren't, and these kind of things. So, they're pivotal as well. But I'll be quiet.
We'll do a few questions. Thank you very much for that. So Pat is asking, how quickly did it become general knowledge among regular Russian troops that being captured was a death sentence? I'm thinking about those small groups of regular Russian troops in the woods.
It's a great question. I think relatively quickly, even to the extent that it's anecdotal and it certainly doesn't represent larger German policy, but you can see in some units attempts to convince the Soviets to surrender and attempts to kind of ameliorate some of this and sort of say, look, we can't go around murdering all of them because otherwise they won't want to surrender. But you also have you also have the propaganda coming from the Soviet side, which looks a lot less like propaganda when it's continually reinforced by actual experience, saying don't surrender anyway. The Soviets put a very high premium on surrendering. And one example very quickly is that a large number of Soviet Red Army prisoners end up at Auschwitz. In fact, Auschwitz II was originally designed to be a massive prisoner of war camp. And the Red Army prisoners that end up there, many of them end up having to build Auschwitz II Birkenau. And something like 900 of them survive the war and are liberated by the Red Army, at which point they're sent to a gulag for having surrendered. So there's pressure on both sides to not surrender.
No, thank you for that. So Mary is asking, but the Ultra and Bletchley Park came up several times in the sidebar. So we'll ask this and then we can move on. What was known via intercepts and what was more? She's making a comment that what was more widely known are two different things. So to kind of clear it up, the Ultra is telling the Allies about some of what's going on, but I'm assuming the information coming out of the wilds of Belarus isn't making it back to the UK.
I don't want to speak past my brief here, but actually, the Einsatzgruppen reports are being decoded in real time as they're being sent forward or sent rearward. So there's a great deal of understanding in the sort of secret world that these things are happening, even when they're being called weather reports and this kind of stuff. So I would say it's quite open knowledge. I mean, doing research for the current book, even in like the Jerusalem Times, they're reporting almost, they're reporting things that are happening in Lviv almost as they're happening. So it's certainly not a secret what's been going on, but it probably doesn't raise necessarily to the level of sort of your common reader in England, for example.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And the other thing I'm thinking about, Phil Blood's great show a couple of weeks ago about the anti-bandit order that comes out in 42, and we've been primarily focusing on 41, but going back to Belarus being a case study for us to understand these events from now, 80 years on, how much back in 41, 42 was Belarus influential to the Germans actually going that next stage of the anti-partisan or anti-bandit order because of this, the muddying that had already been going on there, partisans and Jews and locals? Is Belarus influential?
I think so. I'm certainly not an expert in the sort of anti-partisan war writ large, but one of the things that makes Belarus, I would argue, somewhat distinct from places like Ukraine and the Baltic states is that it doesn't have the same organized collaborationist organizations that you see in the Baltic states and in Ukraine. So it's more fertile ground in many ways for a partisan movement because there are fewer, again, sort of organized local militias that are signing up to fight with the Nazis. And of course, the Nazis don't do themselves any services here because the Belarusians have no real love for the Soviets whatsoever. But very quickly, the Nazis make it clear that actually the Soviets are the better bet in this thing. And then the terrain in Belarus, Belarus is massive. And the terrain is very well suited for partisan warfare, for insurgencies. large swaths of it. This is where you see some of the largest anti-partisan operations as well, because eventually it becomes very much a hotbed of partisan activity.
Okay, thank you. And just to kind of connect with what Nigel has been doing this morning and tomorrow, I mean, obviously you're primarily a Holocaust student, but obviously you teach history and you are former US Army. When we talk about the ultimate failure of Barbarossa and the failure to get to Moscow and so on and so forth, do you see that the irony is the amount of effort that an organization personnel they put into committing these atrocities is actually affecting that progression at the front, or do you think that what was happening at the front was going to happen anyway?
I don't think so. I don't think there's any impact in the sense of resources being diverted. Later on in the war, you will see resources pulled from the Holocaust. For example, in the death marches, one of the reasons why they have to march is that the trains are being used for other things. But I think just at the scale of the war, the logistical challenge that the Germans face was not going to be made any better or much worse by much change in sort of the Holocaust. What you do see is actually a lot of impact of the war on the Holocaust. There's an argument to be made that the Holocaust was initially intended to be carried out after the war, and that Hitler decided things seem to be going pretty well in the East, so let's go ahead and do it now. Certainly, the way the war progressed impacts who is killed when and how that killing takes place. The experience of the Einsatzgruppen and the difficulty logistically in bringing the killers to the victims is one significant factor in changing the focus to these killing centers like Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, and Auschwitz. So you bring the victims to the killers rather than trying to hunt them down in these local areas. So, I mean, I think there are those kinds of impacts. I don't think you have sort of the for want of a nail, the battle was lost kind of situation with resources being developed. And, arguably, the Nazis would never see it that way. They would never see these as two competing sorts of demands. And this is all part of the same war. If we take sort of the racial war paradigm.
Okay, thank you for that. And we had a couple of comments earlier on that I can't go back and find now, but it's about we talk about the establishing of the full-blown, as you mentioned yourself, the death camps to make the industrial killing more efficient from the German point of view. But how much of that was also to have less Germans witnessing the events themselves? Because is there a fallout of having all these people in places like Belarus seeing all this stuff on a daily basis? Is it affecting desertion and dropout rates and breakdowns of officers because they're dealing with this stuff? So it's, on the one hand, it makes the killing more efficient, but it also reduces the number of personnel involved. Is that the case?
Absolutely. And I say this. And which
was the more important one at the time, do you think, or equally important?
Well, I mean, I think what you see in the evolution of the final solution, are all of these factors coming to play in different ways. Certainly, Himmler knew the damage that was being done to his people by the killing process, and I don't mean this by way of sympathy. I mean it by way of empathy, in the sense that we can imagine what it must be like for someone to have to do this, and how, unless that person is a sociopath, and most of them weren't, how that can be traumatic, even if you think you're doing the right thing. And we know Himmler in Minsk visited a killing site and watched a killing take place and became violently ill and had to leave, and said, hurry it up, make this. And so he knew that these things were not positive, and he put out guidance that the SS should have these comradeship evenings, where afterwards where you get together with everybody and you sing songs and you try to sort of forget about the day. People like Baksalevsky, who was a horrible human being, ends up being evacuated for hemorrhoids, ironically. And we have his doctor, his chart, and the doctor diagnosed him essentially with PTSD and said that he was having flashbacks of killing sites. Again, it's not because he necessarily disagreed with it, but because it's just can be damaging to a human being.
They're not in any point questioning the morality of it or the right. They're just questioning the fact that it is having an impact on the mental health. Will be a modern term, but the mental health of the people who are the perpetrators. And so I'm going to caveat it myself. I don't in any way have any empathy or sympathy for these individuals, but it's interesting that they are kind of separating the morality aspect from the fact that it is damaging them in that capacity.
And that is probably a distant second in terms of like factors for why you would go to this model of a central extermination center with gas chambers that can murder 1,000 people in an hour. But it also shows you the extent to which the ecosystem of killers has expanded past these small Einsatzgruppen units to lots and lots and lots of different people, which again speaks to sort of the larger issue of complicity of the Wehrmacht and other units and other sort of elements in this. It's not just the Einsatzgruppen that are doing this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll leave with one question, because I want folks, if you're wondering why I want to end this show, I want to end it short enough so that people who aren't watching it live will find it later on, because I want more people to watch these darker shows. And if we keep it a bit shorter, it's more likely to get that reviewing later on. But I'm going to leave you one last question. Someone's asking you about, this is for you, Waitman, about what narratives about the war you would like to see to change as the historiography on the Holocaust and Wehrmacht continues to shift. So we talked about the maintaining of the teaching of these two aspects, military and Holocaust together, but what narratives particularly would you like to see change?
Gosh, I mean, I think one of them is simply this critical and inseparable connection between what Mary already mentioned, with the Lebensraum, with the racial hierarchy of the world, the racial worldview that the Nazis sort of see the world in. These things all permeated military planning. We haven't talked at all about the Hunger Plan, which was to murder 30 to 40 million Soviet citizens via starvation, which was designed by the military. All of these things provide the environment for this war of annihilation, and provide a permissive background for a variety of crimes. And I think, it's just continuing to push, all the ways in which this is connected. One of the extermination centers initially was using carbon monoxide generated by Soviet tank engines, probably supplied by a German army motor pool unit. Right. I mean, just as a very tiny thing, but these things are all deeply connected, and you really can't separate them, because they are deeply connected. So that's one narrative, certainly, and the experience of the victims, the times and the manners in which they're victimized are often deeply connected to the ways in which the front is moving and decisions that are being made and these kinds of things. And so I think, pointing these things out and pointing out that crimes that are not Holocaust related, in the sense that they're not against Jews, also took place, that are war crimes, that are atrocities, in many cases genocidal, and that the German army and the military was deeply involved in those things as well, I think is also really critical to continue to hammer home.
And I think my final point will be, because there's some brave Germans watching this, kind of acknowledging that this is what their ancestors did, but there is still reasons to dig up, bad choice of words, these other elements of the horror. It's to fully expose it. It's the first stage of admitting you're an alcoholic is admitting you're recovering from alcohol is to admit you're an alcoholic, and I think we need to get to the bottom of everything that was done, so that we can learn from it and move on, or attempt to move on to it. So, we haven't finished with Holocaust studies. People, I think, say, oh, do we need any more books about survivors of the camps? And maybe in that area, perhaps we don't, although I would argue, I think we do. But certainly in the widespread nature, the Wehrmacht and the non-Jewish atrocities and the smaller but no less significant actions, I think there is more work to be done, and I think we will all, as a society, benefit from that work.
And I should point out, and I do in the book, and I often do in other conversations, that this is not a case of brainwashing. There are Germans, there are German soldiers, there are German officers who refuse, who push back. There is a very famous corporal, guy named Anton Schmidt, who literally stole a German army truck and rescued Jews and drove them to the partisans. And they're not statistically significant in the sense of all of the other perpetrators, but what they do is they point out that there were individuals that recognized this was wrong and made different choices. And so there's something positive there, I suppose. I mean, it doesn't outweigh any of the other things that happened, but it also proves that there are those, even at the time, who recognized what was going on was wrong and that they didn't want to be involved in it, and they had the strength to make these moral choices, which I think is important, because we often see, for example, people talk about the Civil War and slavery, and everybody thought slavery was okay. No, they didn't. There were people at the time who thought that slavery was wrong, just like there are people, in the Holocaust who thought that what was going on was wrong as well.
No, definitely. And I think that we'll leave it at that point there. But you mentioned what you're working on right now. So what is your next book or your history project?
So I just finished a book. It's called, tentatively speaking, it's called Between the Wires, the Holocaust, the Yanovska camp and the Holocaust in Lviv. And it's about this place called Yanovska, which is a relatively unknown concentration camp just outside of Lviv in Ukraine. And I'm currently working to get that published. I'm really excited about it. Hopefully that will come out shortly.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there then. So Waitman, thank you very much for joining us. And if you want to come back at some point, give yourself a break and talk about the hunger aspect of that planned starvation of what did you say, 40 million. That would be another interesting, albeit disturbing topic, but that's something that we haven't covered yet. So I think we should maybe tackle that at some point, but I will leave it at that. So thank you very much for joining us. So folks, 2 shows tomorrow. So Nigel Askey is back in the morning at 10 a.m. UK time. And in the evening, we're going back to Operation Cobra in Normandy with Stephen Ossad joining us to do the show that we had to be cancelled from a few weeks ago. So that's about Bradley in Operation Cobra. So I will see you both for those, or see you all for those. So cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye, everybody.